You are 11 days out of Norway, and there is no land in any direction, no compass, no map, no clock, nothing but grey water to the edge of the world. And you are not lost. You know exactly where you are, not roughly, exactly, and the instrument telling you is not in your hands. It is a shadow lying across a scratched piece of wood, the flight of a single bird, the colour of the water under the hull, and 40 years of another man's memory poured into your head before you were old enough to grow a beard. Almost everything people believe about how the Norse crossed this ocean is a story about a clever gadget, a magic crystal that finds the sun through cloud. That is the wrong story. Stay in this boat, and by the end of it you will know what actually carried these people 3,000 kilometres of open Atlantic, and about one word in their language that vanished forever within a few years of the compass arriving. Let me put you properly aboard. The year is around 985, and you are not standing on a longship. Forget the raiding vessel with shields along the rail, and forget the horned helmet too, because no Viking ever wore one. That fantasy was invented by a costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler for a Wagner opera in 1876. Under your boots is a Nar, a cargo ship. Deep, broad, slow, unglamorous, and it is this ship, not the longship, that carried the Norse world across the Atlantic. We know exactly what she looked like, because 5 such ships were scuttled in a Danish fjord to block a channel and lifted out of the mud again in the 20th century. The one archaeologists call Skåldelev 1 is a true ocean trader, about 16 metres long, drawing a single metre of water, worked by a crew of only 6 to 8. She carries a square sail of roughly 90 square metres and just 2 to 4 oars, because out here, oars are decoration. The wind moves you or nothing does. A full-size copy of her, named Ottar, was built at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde in 1999, and she swallows 20 tons of cargo, and there is no cabin. The middle of the ship is an open hold packed with your cattle, your timber, your entire life in boxes, and you live on the small decks fore and aft, out in the weather, for weeks. You are wet on the second day, and you stay wet. You eat dried fish and sour butter, and someone always has a hand on the steering oar, hung over the right-hand side of the stern. By day 11 that hand is not a hand anymore, it is a slab of salt-cracked callus that aches to the shoulder. So how do you steer a thing like this across an ocean with nothing, not the way you imagine? You do not plot a course across a chart, because there is no chart. There were no maps of this ocean, no sextant, not so much as a clock to tell you how far you had run. What you have instead is a line. It is called latitude sailing. Your destination is not a dot on the water. It is a line, a parallel that runs all the way around the world, and you cannot miss a line. So you do not aim at Greenland. You sail north or south along your own coast until the midday sun stands at exactly the right height above the horizon. Then you turn and you run west, and your job for the next 3 weeks is to keep that sun where it is. Hold the height, and the line delivers you. And they wrote these directions down. A passage preserved in the Book of Settlements, the Landnamabok, reads like one skipper handing instructions to another. From Hernum in Norway, the place we now call Bergen, sail due west for Hövarf in Greenland. Keep so far north of Shetland that you can only just make it out in clear weather, and so far south of the Faroes that the sea appears halfway up their mountain slopes. That is not poetry, that is a latitude written in landmarks, running at roughly 61 degrees north, and you could hand it to a crew this afternoon. To hold that line you need to know where north is, and for that there is a tool, although it is a tool historians still argue over. In 1948, on the site of a Norse convent at Unatok in Greenland, someone dug up half of a small wooden disc, about 7 centimetres across, notched around its rim, with a hole in the centre where a pin once stood. Stand the pin up, and it throws a shadow. Mark where the tip of that shadow falls through one whole day, and you have scratched a curve into the wood. On any other day at that latitude, keep the shadow tip riding on the curve, and you are on your line. Drift north and the shadow runs too long. Drift south and it shortens. Compass, chart and clock in one flat piece of timber. There was a cruder cousin too, a shadow board, a plank held at arm's length with its bottom edge on the horizon. Sun above the mark, too far south. Below it, too far north. Now the honest part, because honesty about the past is the whole reason this channel exists. Not every scholar accepts that the Unatok disc was ever an instrument at all. Some read it as decoration, and half of a broken object can be argued about forever. What is not in dispute is the technique. Latitude sailing works. It needs nothing but the sun and a marked stick, and the Norse crossed this water in both directions for 400 years. But notice what the entire system rests on: the sun. And you are in the North Atlantic, where the sky closes over like a lid for days. So what happens on the morning the sun does not come? This is where the famous story arrives, and it is worth getting exactly right, because almost everyone gets it wrong. The sagas mention an object called the Solar Stein, the Sunstone. In the stories, a man holds it up beneath a sky packed with cloud, and it shows him where the sun is hiding. In the 1960s, a Danish archaeologist named Thorkild Ramsku proposed what it might physically have been. Certain crystals, above all Iceland's spar, a clear calcite from the Icelandic ground, do something strange to light. Sunlight scattered across the sky is polarized, arranged in invisible rings around the sun, and that pattern is up there whether you can see the sun or not. Look through the calcite and the image splits in two. Rotate it until the two images match in brightness, and it is aligned with the pattern. Do that twice, and the lines cross where the sun stands behind the cloud. It sounds wonderful, and it might even be true. In 2011, researchers confirmed the physics. Iceland's spar can find a hidden sun to within a few degrees under a fully overcast sky, and a calcite crystal was recovered from the wreck of the Alderney, an Elizabethan warship that sank off the Channel Islands in 1592, lying less than a metre from a pair of navigation dividers, exactly where a navigator would keep it. But that wreck is from 1592, more than 5 centuries after the Viking Age ended, and here is the sentence that matters most in this whole video. Not one sunstone has ever been found at a Viking site, not in a grave, not in a settlement, not in a ship, not one, anywhere, ever. The physics is proven, the Viking use of it is not. It is a hypothesis, elegant and plausible, but there is no direct evidence for it, and anyone who tells you the Vikings crossed the ocean by magic crystal is telling you a story the ground has never backed up, and that matters because of what it leaves behind. Take the crystal away completely, and the crossing still happened. Hundreds of people still reached Greenland, which means the sunstone, real or not, was never the answer. Something else was. Think for a moment about what is in your pocket right now, a phone that knows where you are to within about a metre, because a constellation of satellites 20,000 kilometers over your head is throwing timing signals at it. You never earned that. You have almost certainly driven somewhere this month and could not describe the route afterwards, because you were not navigating, you were obeying. Now take it away, take the map, the road signs, the clock. Now find one specific island, and here is the real cruelty. An island you have never laid eyes on, that you believe exists only because an old man in a hall told you about it when you were 9. That was the job, and they did it in an open boat. So what was the answer? This. They read the ocean itself, the way you read a familiar face. Every single thing out here is information, and you were trained from childhood to hear it. Start with the birds, because the birds are astonishingly precise. A kittiwake will range more than 150 kilometers out to feed, so a kittiwake tells you almost nothing. But a puffin or a guillemot is a completely different report. They rarely work more than about 10 kilometers from their own cliffs. So when a puffin crosses your bow, that is not a bird, that is a measurement. Land is close, and it is close now. And you watch them twice a day with real attention, at first light and at dusk, because at dawn they fly out from land, and at dusk they fly back to it. And that flight line is an arrow drawn across the sky, pointing straight at a coast you cannot see. Then the water itself. Deep ocean is a dead blue-black. Over a bank it goes green, and greener still where a river is pushing silt and meltwater out from a landmass, and you learn those shades the way you learn faces. You watch what floats. Driftwood, a mat of weed torn off rocks by surf, a land insect, a small bird that has no business this far out and is exhausted. You watch the whales, because whale species keep to their own grounds, feeding along the same currents season after season, so a whale is a rough address. You watch the swell, a long steady procession out of the west, and the day it changes shape, something solid is bending it, and you watch the sky hardest of all. One flat cloud sitting perfectly still, while every other cloud in the world slides past it, means an island is standing underneath, holding it up, and that cloud is visible long before the island is. A cold pale glow lying along the horizon is the ice cap throwing daylight back into the air, and it announces Greenland before Greenland announces itself. Then, at the very end, the senses that have nothing to do with the eyes. In fog you listen, seabirds calling, and under them the low, endless sound of surf breaking on rock. And you smell it. Land has a smell of earth and dung and wet grass and wood smoke, and after 2 weeks of nothing but salt in your nostrils, the coast reaches you before you ever see it. And when every one of those fails, you can always carry your own instrument, alive, in a cage. Which brings us to Hrafnaflokey, Ravenflokey. The Book of Settlements says a Norwegian named Floki Vilgurdarson set out deliberately to find the land beyond the Faroes, and took 3 ravens with him, because a raven will not settle on water, and will always run for the nearest land. He released the first, and it turned and flew back astern, toward the Faroes. The land behind is still the closest land. Later he released the second, and it climbed, circled, found nothing worth having in any direction, and dropped back onto the ship. Then the third. It went straight out over the bow and never came back. He followed it, he made landfall, he climbed a mountain, looked down into a fjord choked with drift ice, and named the place, in what was clearly a foul mood, Island, Iceland. He named an entire country out of irritation, and we are still using it. But there are days when there is no sun, no bird, no swell you recognize, only fog. And the Norse had a word for that, which tells you they met it often enough to need one. Hafvilla. Huff is the sea. Vil-ra means wild, bewildered, the same old root that sits inside our own words, wilderness and bewildered. Hafvilla is sea bewilderment. It is not a storm, and it is not a wreck. It is the total, silent loss of every reference you own, for days at a stretch, while the fog lies on the water, and the ship keeps moving, and not one person aboard can say in which direction. The sagas use the word over and over, always in the same flat dread tone, the way we would say the engine has stopped. One man got famous for it. Bjarni Herjolfsson sailed for Greenland, went Hafvilla, and drifted blind for days. When the fog finally lifted, he was looking at a low, forested coastline covered in trees, and Greenland has no forests. He had almost certainly become the first European to see North America, and being a merchant on a schedule, with a hold full of cargo and a father to meet, he did not land. He turned right and carried on, because the cost of getting this wrong was not embarrassment. In the summer of 985, Eric the Red led a fleet out of Iceland to settle the land he had scouted and named Greenland, which was, let us be fair about it, the finest piece of marketing in the medieval world. 25 ships sailed, 14 arrived, some turned back, the rest simply never appeared again. That is roughly 500 people, with their cattle, their sheep, their seed grain, and every tool needed to build a country out of nothing, put onto that water, and 11 ships worth of them did not make land. The survivors founded 2 colonies on the southwest coast, the eastern settlement near what is now Quakiark, and the western settlement up near modern Nuuk. That is the arithmetic of a lost son, not a fine, not a delay, you are simply gone, and no one ever learns where. And this is the part that gets missed every time. We tell this as a story about tools, because we are people who solve things with tools, and we assume they must have had one we have not found yet. But the Norse did not find their way across the Atlantic. They knew it. There is a difference, and it is everything. A farmer crossing his own field at midnight is not navigating. He knows where the ditch runs, where the ground turns soft, where the wall has a gap, because he has walked it 10,000 times and his father walked it before him. That is what this ocean was, not a void to be conquered, but a field that was known, in detail, by people who had grown up inside the knowledge of it. And that knowledge lived in human beings, not in objects. It was memorized and handed down out loud, skipper to boy, in a smoky hall in winter, from a man who had made the crossing 40 times to a boy who would make it 40 more, which is exactly why we find so little of it in the ground. You cannot dig up a memorized sea, which brings us back to that word. Hafvilla runs all the way through the sagas, right up to the 12th century, when the magnetic needle finally reaches the north of Europe. And then, within a very few years of the compass arriving, Hafvilla stops appearing. It simply falls out of the language. Not because the fog stopped, and not because the sea turned kind, but because a people who had lived alongside one specific terror for 400 years was suddenly handed a small iron needle that made that terror unnecessary. And a word you no longer need is a word you stop saying. The compass did not only make them safer, it quietly deleted a feeling. So which of these lands hardest for you? The puffin used as a measuring instrument, the crystal that everybody believes in and that has never once turned up in the ground, or a word for a fear that a piece of technology erased out of a language, tell us in the comments. Because 11 days out of Norway, the man at the steering oar is not holding a gadget. His hands are cracked open with salt. He has not been properly dry since he lost sight of home. And he is watching 3 things: the shadow on a piece of wood, the colour of the water under the hull, and one bird, low off to the right, flying the way birds fly when they are going home.